After the Roman invasion of Britain first began in 43 AD, the creeping imperial frontier gradually pushed northwards, swallowing up all of the Celtic tribes of the south and turning the island into a fully fledged Roman province. By 77 AD, after being made consul and governor of Britannia, Gnaeus Julius Agricola swiftly completed the conquest of Wales and northern England, before pushing into what is now Scotland by land and by sea, establishing forts and strongholds along the way. Agricola was a veteran general and a skilled tactician, having a long military career under his belt, especially in Britain, where he had previously fought under Gaius Suetonius Paulinus at the Battle of Watling Street in around 61 AD, where the Celtic warrior queen Boudicca had finally been defeated. Just like the rest of Britain, the Romans had their work cut out in Scotland, however, and the local tribes, who the Romans called the Caledonii, heavily resisted incursions into their lands, harrying the Romans at every turn, often appearing as if from the mist itself, and then disappearing once again back to their mountain strongholds and deep forests. Finally, after years of facing guerrilla warfare and attempts at subjugating the people of the Lowlands, the Romans arrived at the large settlements to the far north, and the Caledonian coalition recently formed to fight the Romans was forced to do battle at Mons Graupius. Their leader, according to the Roman historian Tacitus, was Calgacus, and the speech attributed to him in his book on the life of Agricola described the Caledonians in a grand speech as the most distant dwellers upon the earth, the last of the free. Although very likely a Roman fabrication, it does stress the weight of the odds that the Caledonians found themselves stacked up against. But nonetheless, Caledonia, unlike the rest of Britain, remarkably remained free of Roman control, never submitting. The Caledonians, described by Tacitus as red-haired and long-limbed, like the rest of the inhabitants of pre-Roman Britain, were a culture of hill fort builders and farmers, divided into a number of nations and tribes. Upon hearing of the Roman advance to the south, it's likely that the Caledonians began to band together in an uneasy alliance to fight against the new threat. Described as the most distinguished for birth and valour among the chieftains, little is known of the life of Calgacus, other than that quote and his name, which means sword holder. Some even argue that his entire existence was a fabrication by Tacitus, although it could be that he was described in much more detail in another now long-lost work. Whether he existed or not, as the native Britons had no written sources of their own, it's unclear whether he was a king or simply a war leader, and similarly unclear whether he held sway over just one of the tribes or all of them. In 79 AD, Agricola began pushing north, with the overall intention of pacifying and Romanising the area entirely. Resistance was light at first, but as they pushed further north, the land became more and more rugged, and the natives more and more hostile. The defenders used the terrain to their advantage, attempting night attacks and ambushes, but the Roman professional army made light work of them. Finally, by 83 AD, at the Battle of Mons Graupius, somewhere in the Grampian Mountains of northern Scotland, the Caledonians threw everything that they had at the Romans in one decisive battle. The numbers may have been fairly equal, at around 15,000 to 30,000 men on each side, with Agricola's legionaries heavily supported by auxiliaries who fought in the centre of his force. Agricola's skilled tactical superiority soon came out on top, forcing the Caledonians into close quarter fighting, rendering their unpointed slashing swords useless as they were unable to swing properly or thrust into the heavily armoured Roman line. Realising the futility of the battle, the Caledonians fled into the highlands with 2/3 of their army still intact. The Romans may have won the battle, but they had very little to show for it. In the aftermath, there was little to keep Agricola in the north, besides prestige, and soon he retreated back south again to the Lowlands, taking hostages of some of the Caledonian leaders, as was customary. His last act in the north was to send his fleet to circumnavigate the coast, thus proving that Britain was indeed an island, before he was finally recalled to Rome in 85 AD. The Caledonians never submitted to the rule of Rome, and even in the immediate aftermath of Mons Graupius, pockets of resistance continued to periodically rise up and fight against them. The Romans soon decided to abandon the conquest of the Highlands entirely, settling on claiming the Scottish Lowlands. They built two walls, Hadrian's Wall between the Tyne and the Solway Firth in 122 AD, and the Antonine Wall further north between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde in 142 AD, although this one would soon be abandoned. The Romans fell back to Hadrian's Wall after severe raids from the Caledonians, who fought persistent border wars with them, invading in 180 AD, 197 AD and throughout the 3rd century. Scotland, like Ireland, never submitted to Rome, and and it was those same defiant Caledonians who eventually evolved over the years, amalgamating with the cultures around them to eventually become the Picts, and finally the Scots. A large number of Scottish people today can at least in part trace an unbroken line of history from Celtic pre-Roman Britain to the present.